I am gonna put this on record.
Really send all the slides to all the meetups on the static website.
That's a true story. That's all.
We accept pull
Me
requests.
too.
Okay, so I wanted to kick this talk off. It's going to specifically be about GatsbyJS, which is like my personal favorite static site generation tool. However, I felt like there was probably a few people in the audience who don't know what static site generators really are, what their use cases are, like why you would want them over using some big framework like Rails or any of the lesser frameworks, because Rails is the best. And so I figured I would start just by kind of telling you what a static site is. So a static site is like, it's kind of weird where we've reached this progression in like technology history, because now we're like, we've gone too far off the deep end. We've made all these like frameworks and languages and all that stuff, and then we really want just what it boils down to, which is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that's really all the browser can render and deal with anyway right now until WebAssembly becomes more popular and awesome. So static site generators are kind of like that weird middle ground between having this like big back-end application and then this really simple, lightweight, just HTML pages that render onto the screen. So static site generators use a server-side language or a framework like Ruby, PHP, Go, Node. I'm pretty positive there is one for every type of web language at least, like out there. I think Cameron and I got into it on Slack, and he like listed like 500 different specific static site generators. So like, yeah. Anyway, there's one for every type of web framework. The reason that they're fun and they're like gaining a lot of traction right now is because developers really enjoy writing them, because it takes all the things that developers hate doing out of the like equation. Developers hate repeating themselves. I mean, everybody's familiar with dry principles, don't repeat yourself. Developers hate repeating themselves. So static sites kind of go to great lengths to prevent you from repeating yourself. They give you a templating language. They give you a way to componentize or modularize what you're writing, even though your output is just these like blog posts or whatever. So they're really developer friendly. Static site generators are really developer friendly. And the reason that I think they're great is because at the end of the day, when you run the build process through whatever version, if you're using Jekyll or Gatsby or Hugo or whatever, the output is just static files. Like that's literally where static site generator gets its name. It's outputting HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Any web browser, like I think ever, can run those three things. So like you could literally, it outputs this directory onto your computer. You can double click on the file under most scenarios and it will open the browser of your choice and run the thing. Now Internet Explorer is stupid, so if you do any cool stuff in JavaScript, it might not work. But you can't blame the static site generator's output for that, because they're trying to be optimistic and hope that you're not using Internet Explorer. So the really awesome thing is that because it outputs just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, you can deploy this pretty much anywhere you want, any web-facing server or even a local computer. And you don't really need a lot of configuration or development operations skills. Like you don't have to know how to set up Nginx or Apache or whatever. Most software as a service providers that do servers like VPSs and stuff like that will have some kind of basic minimal configuration that will just serve files out of a directory. And if you put this built file in that location, these things will be served because they're just HTML. That's literally what web servers have been able to do since the dawn of web servers. Now, because these static site generators are kind of the new hotness and everybody loves them and they're really easy to get started with, they're really easy to use, they're really easy to deploy, there's a lot of these like software as a service providers that give you this basic configuration to deploy your static site app. Netlify is going to be Brian's SaaS of a choice when it comes to deploying a thing. And Netlify has some really cool features. AWS, Amazon Web Services, which everybody should be familiar with to some degree because the entire internet runs on AWS. They have their own way of deploying to their stack, which is S3 and CloudFront. And it's a really simple guide. I mean, it's like 5 steps and you've got your deployment working. And Surge is a really cool static site generator that actually, is a really cool static hosting site that Brian actually turned me on to. And if you're really big fans of the command line, you can literally just like type Surge in your directory and it will serve those files for you out of that directory onto a web-facing URL, which is awesome. The last kind of point about static site generators that actually make most developers a little nervous is there's no database. Obviously, you can use a static site generator to generate something that connects to a database, but that's like on you, man. Like you'll have to configure it because the whole point of this is that these bits of data are relatively static. They're not pulling dynamic content from a database. They're not pulling, you're not doing CRUD operations, like that kind of stuff. So with all that being said, like why do I like Gatsby? And the reason I like Gatsby specifically is because I needed, for my computer and my developer setup, I literally needed nothing to get started because I already had NPM on my computer and I'm pretty sure that's the only dependency that it had. NPM or Yarn, because Yarn is installed via NPM, so it will just install Yarn for you as long as you have NPM. So like I had NPM on my computer already, and I literally could just type npm install Gatsby CLI, and I was ready to start building static sites, or static site with Gatsby. And it was super easy. The reason I like Gatsby over some of the other static site generators is because it has an incredibly fast build time because it's JavaScript. The compilation is literally I made a change, did some things, pushed it up to GitHub, and Netlify, which has some automatic hooks to do my deployments for me, was able to get the changes, pull them down through GitHub, build my new thing, and deploy it to their server in 48 seconds. All automatically, which was awesome. And 48 seconds for a deployment and build CI is awesome. There are tests in Gatsby. I've noted this because I do a lot of testing now. I have never written a test for Gatsby ever, so I'm just going to like put that out there. I have written Jest test, which Gatsby's built in React, so Jest works with it. But I've never written tests for Gatsby because there's lots of reasons. I think you should all write tests all the time on everything you do. That's going to be my like public service announcement. But I don't do it. Anyway, another reason I like Gatsby, and this is kind of true for all the static site generators, is that you can pretty much use any editor or IDE because you're writing JavaScript. Like, end of the day, you're just writing JavaScript. Almost every editor that I've ever seen, even like just regular rich text editors, will allow you to write some type of scripting language in there. And normally the support is for JavaScript. So yeah, you can write it on, you can literally, I keep joking in Slack about Notepad++, but like Notepad++ is pretty legit, and you can definitely use this to type Gatsby. One of the big sell points for me specifically with Gatsby is that it's written using React JS framework, which React was developed by Facebook, which I hate Facebook as a company. I hate everything that Facebook does, but React was like the one gleaming like good thing that they've ever created. And React solved a lot of problems that I didn't like, that I don't believe HTML solved by itself. React gave me a better, more structured way to build my applications. And like that's literally at the end of the day why I like React, is because it solved a problem very specifically that I had. I like writing React because it couples somewhat dynamic JavaScript writing to how I want to interact and interface with my DOM. So I like React a lot. The biggest sell point to Gatsby, in my opinion, is that the data source for it is GraphQL, which if you guys aren't familiar with GraphQL, I'm going to give kind of a little overview of GraphQL. But GraphQL is by far, up to this point in my web development career, GraphQL has been the absolute best way I've ever seen data to be structured. There's a caveat to that. Human beings write the structure, so human beings can definitely screw it up. But GraphQL, or the graph as I call it, and many other developers online, the graph just gives you a solid structured data, and it's self-documenting to some degree, because I'm going to show you guys in a minute. Another sell point on Gatsby is that you can use any GraphQL data source. You don't actually have to use the GraphQL that Gatsby, the GraphQL client that Gatsby has built in. You can actually take your data source from WordPress, or Amazon has this thing called AppSync. All of these are just GraphQL endpoints. I actually recently found out that GitHub has a GraphQL endpoint. Blizzard has a JSON endpoint, and then there's another service you can use to turn that JSON service into a GraphQL endpoint. So like you can get all kinds of cool data as your GraphQL data source, and then you can do whatever you want to it using the static site generator. So it's not just for things like writing your own personal site, writing your own personal blog, writing your own some kind of brochure site for a marketing agency. You could write literal web applications using Gatsby. The last selling point on Gatsby is that there are a lot of really cool starters that are used with Gatsby. A starter, you can kind of think of it like a template in the sense of like WordPress's templates, because it gives you kind of a framework for the thing that you're trying to build. There's a blog template, a blog starter. There's a, actually I can just pull up the starters. There's a whole bunch. There's a slideshow starter. There's one with Google's material framework. There's one, I don't even know, that looks like a marketing brochure site. There's like a whole lot of them, but not so many that they're like WordPress. They're like all slight variations of each other. These are literal like, this thing does this one very specific thing really well. So yeah, Gatsby's awesome. I was going to take this next little bit to kind of demonstrate why I like Gatsby so much. So let's turn on VS Code. This is going to suck because I'm blind, and so I can't, well, I guess I could turn it up. Does anyone know in VS Code quickly how to increase the font size? Command plus. That looks good. Yeah. Y'all can see that? Okay, so this Gatsby blog was literally, minus a few minor tweaks, was literally me typing on the console, Gatsby, new Gatsby blog. I typed that on the console, and it spit out this blog starter, which is the default starter for Gatsby, written by the guy who originally wrote Gatsby, which makes it even more awesome. And once you get Gatsby installed and you've got your starter and whatever, and you want to see it on the computer, so you just type Gatsby develop, which is Gatsby, the command line tool, is the only thing you have to install to get Gatsby working and doing things. So npm install Gatsby CLI or npm install global Gatsby CLI gives you these commands. I can run Gatsby develop in my URL. It's going to build a development version of this, which is non-uglified and non-optimized images and all that good stuff. So it's up, and I can now go to localhost 8000. And so last night at like 10 o'clock, I said, so I was going to use just the basic blog, but instead I was like, you know what, I'm going to write a blog for Jack Rackham, the really famous pirate in the mid-1700s. So in 1718, Jack Rackham decided he wanted to be a pirate. And so he was a privateer prior, in case any of you guys are interested in pirate history. He was a actual privateer requisitioned by the governor of the Bahamas. So before that, that's what he did. He was a legal pirate. And then he decided he wanted to be a real pirate. So he was like, you know what? I need a new flag. So he got some people to build him in this really cool flag, which is actually probably one of the most famous pirate flags of all time. To build this blog post, I literally just took the blog post that was already there, and new flag, and I just wrote the code that I wanted to write in it. I mean, not code, but just text. It's Markdown. So yeah, this little stuff in the top part is called front matter. Most static site generators have this thing. It's a way to give each individual page or post or whatever you want to call it, article, it's a way to give that thing metadata. So my metadata for this post is a title and a date. This is the actual date in which Jack Rackham first flew the Jolly Roger with the double swords at the bottom. So yeah, so he was talking about how cool it was that he paid this person to like design it for him. And so I wrote all this stuff, and it's in Markdown, and then I saved it. I added this pirate flag into here so that I could easily reference it. If anybody's familiar with Markdown, you could do this. Oh wait, that's the link to the article. This was internal link, so yeah, flag.png, but you can just as easily link to external resources, so whatever. That's all just Markdown stuff. If you're not familiar with Markdown, GitHub has an awesome Markdown thing. What's up?
The bit in square brackets, does that get rendered in the actual site to be the alt tag?
Yes. Yep. That is exactly what that is. It's alt on images, and it's title on links. And it's the text for the link. So yeah, and then there's a quote and whatever. You can look up Markdown stuff on GitHub. They have the best cheat sheet out there, which you all should be using to write your readmes. Readme.markdown, because I know everybody in here keeps their readmes maintained really well and stuff like that. So yeah. Anyway, so the reason I wanted to suggest this is because like literally, I think I spent 15 whole minutes on this thing, and I spent most of that time trying to Google images of Calico Jack Rackham and pirate flags and reading the Wikipedia article. So like, I literally did Gatsby new. I changed the title, which is actually done in the Gatsby config. And there's this thing called site metadata. So this is data that's accessible on any page. You'll want to do things like your Twitter handle, your Instagram link, your God forbid, Facebook URL. You'll want to put stuff like that in there. You can add any bit of data that you want here, and it will be accessible in the graph. So let's talk about the graph for a split second. So let's go to bio. So no, let's not go to bio. Bio was a bad place. Blog post, that's what I wanted. So this is what a query to the graph looks like. This is a little bit too big for me. I'm going to decrease it just a smidge. Okay, so this is what a query in the graph looks like. And the reason I love the graph is because you're very explicit as to what data you want for each page. So like what I told GraphQL by doing this is I said, hey, GraphQL, like I need you to go into the site metadata and get me the title and the author. because I'm going to use that somewhere in this thing. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But then more importantly, I need you to get me, this is a Gatsby specific thing. I need you to render in Markdown the field, slug, whatever, the ID, the excerpt, and the HTML, as well as the front matter of all my posts. Or no, this is for a specific post. So for my specific post. And then it says, okay, cool. Well, I'm going to give you that as a data object. So I have this data object on props, because this is React, in my blog post template component. So for each post that is rendered, I should have props, and it should have a data prop on props. And on that, I'm going to have Markdown remark, which is the exact same thing that we have down here. And I'm calling that post so that it's more human readable. And then I'm going to get the site data, which is, this is some magic that not Kyle Simpson, what's his face, from Gatsby wrote. I don't like this. I prefer to just say this.props.data.site metadata.title, but whatever. And then I want to get the post excerpt and then page context. Page context is a really interesting thing with Gatsby. It gives me the ability to paginate. So on my post, I go down here. This is the next post, which is things aren't looking great because in 1719 he had a warrant for his arrest, and then in November 18th of 1720 he was hung. So this allows me to iterate over my posts. These are all things that are given to me by the graph. And let's talk a little bit more detail about the graph. So Gatsby gives you this URL for GraphQL. What? No. I want it. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong buttons. We good? Okay. So, what I was saying about things being a little bit self-documenting is that I don't know anything about the graph. Let's pretend that I'm a lowly front-end developer and some back-end developer has written this graph for me. And I don't know anything about the data structure. I know nothing about anything. The cool thing about GraphQL is that it is introspective. It knows everything about itself, which is awesome. That's the kind of that's the kind of thing you want out of your data source. So I can hit Control space in GraphQL. This is graphical. It's a front-end client that reads the back-end schema of your GraphQL. And these are all the things that on the root level query I can research. So I know just from working with Gatsby that Markdown remark is what they call posts. So there's all Markdown remark, and then there's just Markdown remark. That's a single post. This is all of the posts. So I'm going to go into this, and then these little squiggly lines are really nice. It's trying to tell me like, hey, you need something else. Something's wrong. So I know that I need, because this is an object that contains many objects, I need data off of it. So a node, when I get down into Edge's node, this is going to actually be a post. So what data do I want off of the post? Well, I know I want HTML, right? Like that's the actual crap that I want to render. And then I know I need some front matter stuff, which is like going to be title, and sure, why not? Let's get date. And so when I hit this run button, it's going to go and query all the posts. It's going to give me an array of them under edges, and each node is going to give me its HTML front matter of title and date. So here we go. Like I said, edges, this is an array of nodes. The first node is HTML, blah, blah, blah. He fell in love with Anne Bonny and, crap, I can't think of the other girl's name. Anywho, yeah, and then it gives me the front matter, which is things aren't looking great, and the date, which is 17/19/05/24. That's the data that I wrote in the static page, the Markdown file. So that's awesome. Then a little bit further, this is the last post, and this is the new flag post. So yeah, this is one of the greatest things about GraphQL, in my opinion, is that it's so helpful to be able to ask questions of your data source. Like I said, I'm a front-end developer. I don't know what my data structure looks like, but I could easily look through here and kind of glean information that I would otherwise not know about. I mean, I'm sure you could learn your back-end language, whatever it is, your data source, Postgres or whatever, and you could probably figure out how to query things yourself. But I feel like that's a lot of wasted time when this thing kind of documents for you. One of the other good things about GraphQL, which I've not looked into Gatsby's GraphQL, but you can actually write documents and descriptions when you add types to GraphQL. So I'm actually looking, and this is actually pretty nice. So if I did all site plugin, it would give me an array of all the plugins that are installed on this site. Gatsby has plugins for some cool stuff. I could get access to all the directory nodes, which are anything under the source folder, which is then compiled into the public folder. I could say, give me just all the files, which is actually how we're doing the slug params. So like, if you notice in my backend, the folder names, which are new flag, not great, it gets worse, those are also my slugs. So it gets worse is the slug for new beginnings. That's my email. I don't want that. Yeah. So yeah. You can actually go in here and figure out all the stuff. So like we knew we did an all markdown remark. We wanted to look at all of the posts. So if I click on markdown remark connection, it'll tell me the things that I can get off of it. So I can get edges, which is going to be a markdown remark edge. And then inside of there, I'm going to get a node. And then it's going to tell me, okay, well, on that node, you can look up an ID, a parent, the children of that thing, other data, front matter, which we queried, HTML, which we queried. You can get your HTML turned into JSON, which is what they'd use for the RSS feeds, because Gatsby out of the box has RSS feeds. That's pretty cool. Didn't even know you could do this. You can get a word count of your post. Meh. That's cool. That's out of the box. So yeah, this was essentially my intro to Gatsby and a little bit of static site generators and GraphQL, which GraphQL is definitely the winner here. Do I have more time? All right, I'm going to talk about React's component architecture a little bit because I think there's a little bit of confusion and people get nervous when you hear that a static site generator is written in a language. So like Jekyll is written in Ruby, like it uses Ruby. And so people who are not familiar with Ruby will shy away from Jekyll because they're like, I don't know Ruby. Like I don't want to do anything in Ruby. And I feel like that's a bit of a misnomer because like Brian hates Ruby and everything about Ruby, and he loves Jekyll, which is written in Ruby. And really all Ruby is giving you in Jekyll is the liquid templating language. Same thing with React here. You do have to write React. I'm sorry, at the end of the day, Gatsby is React. And I love React. But I think that this is a great learning opportunity with static site generators to, if you want to learn a little bit about the development practices of a different language, this is actually a pretty interesting way to get started because with Jekyll, you have to install Ruby on your computer. And to be completely fair to Ruby, that's 90% of the difficulties with playing with Ruby is like getting it installed and working on your computer because there's a lot of stuff you have to do. Like you have to have a version manager for Ruby very specifically. There's there's all different types of versions of Ruby, and you have to have the right one for your Jekyll command. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff. So you have an opportunity to learn by using these static site generators. Before I was really a big fan of React, I built a Gatsby. This is back when Gatsby was technically in like beta or whatever. I kind of built a Gatsby blog, and I was like, wow, this is actually really fun, because I realized that the JSX syntax that React loves to use is really just how I would rather describe my HTML nodes. Like, this layout component is literally a div with some attributes on it. But by calling it layout, I'm more semantically saying, like, hey, everything inside of this is going to inherit the layout component. So whatever I give layout, these things underneath it are going to inherit. And then I have a thing called a helmet, which is actually that's a different thing. Helmet is a really cool way with React and some other single page applications to hoist information up. So if you look here, we have this meta name, and then you have description, and then meta content, and then that's the site description. That's actually hoisting it up into the head of your HTML body. Well, that's HTML head. It's hoisting it into the HTML head and actually adding meta content up there. It's also adding a title for your page. There's some HTML attributes, so you can set the language. You can do a lot of other cool stuff in there. And in fact, on my personal blog, I do a lot of open graph tags, so that like when I copy and share links to people, I get the nice like Facebook formatted link with like an image and then a title and a description and author and all that good stuff. So like I have these formatted cards, which is what Twitter calls them. I don't. Well, this one's Gatsby helmet.
I think Gatsby helmet is NFL.
Yeah.
Helmet is
Yeah,
actually
that's what it in.
made by NFL, which is kind of fun.
Right. It was forked. React helmet is forked from NFL helmet. I remember that when me and Ryan were looking at it originally.
Well, React helmet is NFL. But I guess theirs is forked. But it's still
Right.
kind of fun. So.
Yeah.
It is clever naming.
But the like, personally, I think one of the beauties of React is that like everything doesn't have to be a component. You can write an H1 tag, which is what you're writing. Like, it doesn't have to be nested in a component. And when you boil down your components, they are just HTML nodes. So they are divs. They are H1s, paragraphs, unordered list, whatever. And React, the community behind React, is really a big fan of CSS in JS, but also styled components and other ways to skirt around writing styles or writing them inappropriately. So like in this default blog, there's a lot of times where they just write this styling right there, which in React it's whatever. That's pretty commonplace. But yeah, link is actually just a Gatsby thing. So like there's a doc on Gatsby's website that will like give you some really great starting stuff for any of the API things specifically. Literally the first thing is Gatsby link. So it's telling you about like how it handles the router, which Gatsby has its own like idea of how router should work. So it's built in there. There's Node APIs. All these are accessible like out of the box with Gatsby. So yeah, I'm gonna wrap this up. The last thing I posted, I'm gonna post this slideshow somewhere. Actually, it's on the web right now. Like you can access this. I'll put this in like Memtech Slack. But these are some links to like the GatsbyJS website, which is really easy to get to. A really interesting article of how to deploy Gatsby specifically to AWS, which is very cheap hosting. It's not free, but it's very cheap and decent hosting. While I was on that vein, I went to the AWS Static Sites website, which is awesome. It's how to like deploy your content to S3 and have it hosted out of there with really awesome AWS caching and all of the like beauty that comes behind using the AWS ecosystem. And then there's an article of deploying it to Netlify, which I kind of wanted to point out that this slideshow that I built was a Gatsby slideshow starter, and I just added all the data to it. And so literally within 10 minutes, maybe, I had this really good slideshow app with my data in it. And within about, 5 minutes of editing it and then 48 seconds of deploying it, and now I have it hosted on Netlify for free, and it's got me a public-facing URL, which I'm going to post into Slack. So anybody there can do it to it. Yeah, that's all I got.
Any questions about that?
How do you, like, add a new blog post? Is it assuming you're going to code, or is there a way to have some sort of unified screen?
So with the static site generator, there's no UI for it, but Netlify has its own CMS, which is a JavaScript-based CMS that uses GitHub's OAuth for authentication, and there's a really easy guide for installing that in Gatsby, and it gives you a UI to your structured data. And so, like, yeah, you can technically use that as a CMS.
That's fully open source, and what ends up happening is it actually pushes to the GitHub repo and issues either a pull request or merges and matches and how you set it up.
Yeah, and it's really neat, and I love it. The one problem that I have with all CMSs other than WordPress is how they handle media. Like, media is such a difficult problem to solve, just in general. Just media is difficult. And Netlify is no better than anybody else at handling media. So it's still Markdown at the end of the day. So, like, the magic you can do with Markdown is the magic you can do in Netlify CMS, which means none at all, especially when it comes to positioning images or getting different sizes of images, which Gatsby actually does give you out of the box. Gatsby gives you the ability to, like, you may have this like 1900 pixel image, but your website's only ever going to be rendered, the content's 900 pixels. You can tell Gatsby to give me the 900 pixel width version of that thing, and it will actually give you the 900 pixel. And it's not the cheating way where it like gives you the 1900 pixel but then adds the content header of 900 pixels or whatever. No, it's actually a 900 pixel image, which is awesome. Netlify is really great at caching those images. So like once it turns it into that 900 pixel image, it's actually too good at caching because it will cache things really hard for very long. But it'll give you, yeah, and it gives you the like, the medium style, medium articles style image thing where it's like fuzzy at first, and then it gives you that out of the box. Gatsby does, and it's awesome. But it always falls short of the like image manipulation in my content, and I think that sucks. But that's just a problem. I think that's a problem. This is, like I said, it's a difficult problem to solve across the board. WordPress did a really good job because they're gigantically bloated. And so, like, you could easily write, a gig worth of JavaScript files to make Markdown do what you actually want it to do. But cost-benefit analysis there, I guess. Yeah.
So you're consuming these third-party APIs. Like, normally there's like an API key, like a token involved, and like frameworks for putting those like EMVs, and they're not version controlled. Does that exist inside of Gatsby?
Wait another 20 minutes, and I'll show you how to do it in Netlify.
I was going to say that where you're hosting the static site is going to be what handles your env files. Otherwise, they're going to be public. Like, these are static files. So you put them on a server, somebody can, unless you on your server changed the permissions of that thing, which then it'd be hard to expose the API. I had the same problem with the Blizzard API because I was like, you only have 10,000 calls a month to the Blizzard API. And I was like, I know the moment I publish this in JavaScript, some like Russian or Chinese hacker is going to get my API key and then like spam it 10,000 times like within a day. And so my solution to that was I pushed to Amazon AWS, which is why I kind of weighted a little heavy towards AWS. And AWS has a way of like giving an IAM role to a file, and then that IAM role is only for people coming from Blizzard.net or Battle.net, which is the API URL endpoint. So like AWS is awesome. Permissions on AWS are like
But there's still
insane.
your repository there, right? You're just using AWS.
Yep. And so if you're in a public GitHub repository like I am for most of my stuff,
Yeah.
it's there.
So I got you covered. Isn't that what I got you covered too?
Any other questions, comments?